Well, welcome everybody to the second seminar in the series Team Science across the New Jersey ACTS Consortium. This university-wide virtual seminar series is hosted by the Team Science Core of New Jersey ACTS, which is led by me, Nancy Reichman, Dan Horton, who's one of our panelists today, and Ralph Gelati. The series features leaders and team members of interdisciplinary research projects taking place within the NJX Consortium to learn about how complex research teams are formed, operated, and achieve success. Each event revolves around a large project that's funded through one of the federal grant mechanisms that are designed to foster interdisciplinary high-impact research, including R01 multiple principal investigator research grants, U01 research project cooperative agreements, and P-series program, project, and center grants. Today, we will be hearing about the Corona Cohort Study of the risk and susceptibility of developing COVID-19 in US healthcare workers, which I believe is an R01 multiple PI research grant. Several members of the study team are here, and Ralph will introduce them momentarily. In addition to providing a high-level overview of the project, the panelists will provide their perspectives on the advantages and challenges associated with interdisciplinary team research, critical competencies for leading effective research teams, and useful strategies for facilitating effective collaboration. So I'll hand it to Ralph to introduce the individual speakers.
Great. Thank you so much, Nancy. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. We have a really accomplished group, and I'm only going to highlight some of their titles, beginning first with Dr. Emily Barrett, Associate Professor of Epidemiology at the Rutgers School of Public Health, Dr. Jeff Carson, Provost for New Brunswick at Rutgers Biomedical and Health Sciences, and a Distinguished Professor of Medicine at Rutgers Robert Wood Johnson Medical School, Dr. Maria Laura Gennaro, Professor of Medicine and Epidemiology at New Jersey Medical School, Dr. Daniel Horton, Assistant Professor of Pediatrics and Epidemiology at Rutgers Robert Wood Johnson Medical School, Dr. Ray Panettieri, Vice Chancellor for Translational Medicine and Science at RBHS and Professor of Medicine at Rutgers Robert Wood Johnson Medical School, and not with us today, but part of the team, Dr. Martin Blaser, the Henry Rutgers Chair of the Human Microbiome and Director of the Center for Advanced Biotechnology and Medicine. We're really thrilled for your presentation and appreciate you taking the time to be here.
It is a real pleasure to present as part of this team, to have been a part of this project, and to help tell you about how this came about and then what we've accomplished as a team, as multiple PIs and many more. Focused on the Rutgers Corona Cohort, but we'll also mention some related studies that our team has been involved with. Here are just some disclosures. The project has been NIH funded, as we'll tell you a little bit more. We've also had industry funding for various projects related to it and for our team, and other disclosures here. Just to say the overview of the first part of this. First, we'll talk about the origins of the Rutgers Corona Cohort, or what we call the RCC for short. Then we'll give an overview of the study itself, tell you about the continuation of the RCC, the part that has been funded by an MPI R01 grant. We'll mention some related studies to the RCC, tell you a little bit about the Clinical Trials Office from RBHS, which has helped make all of this possible, and then we'll transition to the Q&A about team science and collaboration. It's going to be a relay, so I'm going to pass the baton off to Jeff to kick us off with the origins of the RCC.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Thanks, everyone, for inviting me to participate. So I don't know that this history is, I think this is something everyone has lived through in the last few years. You know, when you go back and you start to look what happened here, you go back to this mystery pneumonia-like illness in China. and what turned out to be COVID, of course. Next slide, please. And this disease, which we knew nothing about at the time, and I think in the beginning we really weren't clear we had a serious problem at all. But then it began to get identified in the U.S. and this is a public announcement by Washington State Department of Health of cases that were happening in nursing homes in Seattle. Next slide, please. This slide describes the rise in the number of cases, and it has a control of SARS, which was a pandemic or a serious infection that began kind of in a similar way to COVID, but you can see that it was far less infectious and did not cause nearly the number of cases that COVID has developed. And you look at that red line and it's going straight up, and it kept going and going and going. And of course, that was what was so terrifying during the beginning of this pandemic. Next slide, please. So, we here in New Jersey, we're certainly in the middle of all this. And, this has to do almost surely with international travel and the spread of infections. And, we have 3 large airports in the New York metropolitan area, of which, one big one, Newark's in New Jersey. And this community is fully linked with the rest of the world. And so hardly surprising that cases came from China into the U.S. and that the New York metropolitan area, including our state of New Jersey, was in the middle of this mess. Next slide, please. So this precipitated a group to get together, and I think others are going to talk about this more. But we began with, I think it was like almost nightly calls. Zoom calls among all of us. I think we were in Zoom, might have been WebEx back in those days. And we spent so much time talking and generating ideas. And you can see here, this is a letter from Marty to one of his contacts at the NIH, posing an idea of enrolling a cohort of in this case Rutgers students. That we were going to gather samples and blood samples, and then with Marty involved, there's going to be microbiome, of course, and develop this cohort. So next slide, please. And then over time, what happened, in not too short a time, because we were sprinting, trying to get all this thought through, thinking about it all. Ideas were being generated almost every night, and we moved to the healthcare worker setting because we are healthcare workers. We were hearing and seeing what was happening to our colleagues, and this, of course, generated hypotheses that were very close to our heart, to ourselves, for that matter, being at risk for these illnesses. So, we got permission to write a UO1 supplement. Next slide, please. And it was focused, a lot of it was thinking about what was the risk of healthcare workers. And we were reading reports about how this disease was spreading rapidly, especially in healthcare workers in China. And one of the most frightening numbers that I think we had a better handle on in China, because I think China kind of kept things secret in a lot of ways, but we started to learn what was happening in Italy. And it was terrifying. And there were a huge number of doctors who got sick and died from this disease in Italy, especially. And it was this sort of history that was terrifying for all of us who were trying to take care of these patients, and of course led to the hypotheses that we wound up testing. Next slide, please. Okay, and and it's interesting. Thank you for adding this. What was the risk? Well, first of all, you're exposed to these people. So 2 is you didn't really know how to protect yourself at first. And everyone was working like crazy hours because there were so many sick patients. And all this led to a really serious risk for our healthcare colleagues. Next slide. And this slide, which is a complicated slide, simply says that if you are a healthcare worker, you were more likely to get infected and your family was more likely to get the same disease. And that was really the key point here. So it's clear that we had a great deal of interest in this because we're talking about ourselves. Many of us are involved with clinical care, and then our colleagues who we work with at the university. So this led to a great deal of interest in building this cohort. Dan, I'll turn it back to whoever the next person is.
I think I'm up next. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how the observations that Jeff mentioned shaped the way we thought about developing a study, which evolved into the Rutgers Corona Cohort. So essentially, we kind of had two broad domains of questions we were interested in. So first was, how does COVID actually affect our bodies? How does it affect our immune response? And then secondly, how is it affecting our healthcare workforce? Because we saw, as Jeff mentioned, all of these anecdotes about what was going on internationally and how the workforce was being decimated. So with that, we saw an urgent need to better understand rates and risk factors for transmission in healthcare workers in particular. Next slide. So we developed 5 specific aims. And at the time, I'll mention that we didn't have any federal funding. This was thinking towards a larger grant. So our aims were to assess baseline prevalence of SARS-CoV-2 to determine the incidence of the illness in healthcare workers and compare them to a non-healthcare worker comparison group, also at Rutgers, to identify risk factors for acquiring the illness and developing the disease, to determine the duration and extent of SARS-CoV-2 shedding, and then to characterize the natural history of infection. And of course, at this point, there are thousands of papers out there on the topic, but at the time, we're talking early March 2020, there was very, very little in the literature. It was largely unknown. Next slide. So with all of that in mind, we worked furiously to establish a prospective cohort to characterize the factors related to viral transmission and disease severity in our Robert Wood Johnson Rutgers healthcare system, both in healthcare settings and again in this non-healthcare exposed comparator group. Next slide. So we had lots of conversations about who should be included. Ultimately, what we landed on was adults age 20 or over, not pregnant or breastfeeding, not currently or very recently ill. So we were looking for folks who were not COVID positive at baseline initially, no fever at baseline. Healthcare workers, we identified 2 hospitals, and we really wanted folks who had patient contacts, so working with patients 20 or more hours a week. And then our comparator group was Rutgers faculty, staff, and students who did not have patient contact. Next slide. So the approach that we took was essentially we recruited folks at baseline. We did surveys to understand demographics, lifestyle, sources of exposure, potential symptoms, use of PPE, and more. Next slide. And we scheduled everyone for a series of 6 visits. So there was a baseline visit followed by 5 more visits over the course of 26 weeks. Next slide. And at each of those visits, we collected a swab of the throat. We collected saliva samples. We collected blood, all of which were banked for future work, as well as used for testing for SARS-CoV-2. Next slide. And then finally, in between these visits, we administered regular questionnaires. We asked folks to take their temperature daily, and we collected clinical data from medical records in patients who ended up needing medical treatment. And next slide, and I think I'm turning it over to Dan.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. So, you heard about the components of the RCC, and like any cohort, we needed to do basic parts about putting the study together. We needed to design it, write the protocol, put the team together on the research side and the logistics side and recruitment. We needed to build the study database, identify the questions and questionnaires, put it, build it pretty much from scratch. We needed to obtain all of the equipment and arrange all the logistics to get those samples, to transport them, to process and store, and then analyze them. So, it was a lot of work, and, we did it from the first phone call that we had together on March 9th, we did all of that within 2 weeks. And in the process, we submitted a supplement to a supplemental grant to the NIH, and we got IRB approval. From that point, within 2 weeks, we had recruited and enrolled over 800 people, with hundreds more who were interested but couldn't get into the RCC. And then 1 month later, we had gotten that first supplement awarded from the NIH. So it was an incredibly frenetic and dizzying time that required efforts of so many people coming together around a common goal and a common vision. And really, it could not have happened without an incredible team, only some of whom are shown here, led by three incredible and experienced PIs, Marty, Jeff, and Ray. And then you had this central team of investigators and staff and expertise from laboratory science, immunology, microbiome, clinical trials, epidemiology, biostatistics, finances. But this was really only the tip of the iceberg. You had also a larger set of investigators and staff, a fleet of volunteers who were coming together to staff the different sites. There were 3 different command centers across 3 different cities. An incredible collaborative effort. And in cooperation with a biorepository, RUCDR, which helped process and analyze and store these samples. So much like you had mobilization of clinicians of all stripes kind of working to treat patients who were coming into hospitals sick with COVID, you had maybe an analogous mobilization of people across the university and across various different roles and types of expertise to make this happen. I'll also mention, an important part of this project was the analysis, detection of antibodies to SARS-CoV-2, which happened in Marilla's lab, as shown here. And they were not only measuring, they were developing assays, as this was going along to help make that possible. So, 6 months into the study, as we're planning for next steps and next funding opportunities, we were thinking about what are the unanswered questions that still need to be addressed. And much as Emily said, these now seem have been addressed by many, many papers, but some of those questions are shown here. So why were some people getting so much sicker and other people not getting sick at all? And also, what happened after infection? What were the long-term health consequences? And did that depend on how sick people got with that infection? I'm going to pass the baton mid-slide to Marilla.
Yeah, and thank you, Dan. And now we are in the middle of 2020, and of course vaccines start being developed. Rutgers actually was one of the clinical sites in the vaccine, the COVID vaccine trials. And so we could begin to think about developing questions of how, not only how the infection would affect the immune response, but how then with vaccination, we would have this interaction between a response in immunity induced by vaccination, immunity induced by infection, and how, and depending on which would have the body would have experienced first, what the consequences would be. And so there was the work was preparing the ground for actually a continuation of the work. So we in the following year we applied for. So we were working at that point mostly with the supplement that was mentioned already, but we thought that we could develop and use the work in the cohort to go further ahead in these questions, and we needed to have a perspective in terms of funding. So we wrote a grant that was an MPI grant, and Marty Blaser was the contact PI of the application, Emily Barrett, myself, and Dan Horton, the MPIs. And that would be used to allow us to define biomarkers of the disease, of how the infection would start and how it would evolve, and the clinical evolution of the disease, and determine what the natural history of the infection was. And now again, it's another theme that now we hear about all the time. What are the long-term consequences of SARS-CoV-2? But at the time, it was one of the initial ideas of seeing would there be long-term sequelae of infection, and would these long-term sequelae differ depending on the severity of the initial infection? And again, what were the immunological markers of all of this? Next, please. And I think that we've all been introduced already, so I don't think we need to go much into this. As I said, Marty was actually this grant was awarded. So Marty is the contact PI, and Emily, Dan, and myself are the MPIs. And by putting together, so since we're talking about team science, here we have a collaboration of pediatrician, immunologist, microbiologist, infectious disease experts, pharmacoepidemiologists, epidemiologists. So I think that this also, the composition of the MPI group shows how multidisciplinary the project has been since its inception. I think next, please. Oh, I pass the baton to Ray.
Well, thank you. And I want to highlight that undoubtedly the RCC embodies everything about team science. As you can imagine, there's no possibility for an individual investigator, individual lab, individual to be able to accomplish what was accomplished. It took a team. Matter of fact, the outputs of the RCC with multiple supplements received about $8.2 million in federal funding. That included the R01. We had almost within the first 6 months to year, 10 publications. We provided the samples for the emergency utilization authorization of the first COVID-19 antibody test globally. And from saliva, and the antibody test was Marilla's test, but the PCR was in conjunction with RUCDR. An amazing feat. And as you can understand, it required dedication, not only from PIs, not only from the staff you heard, but from volunteers to actually see the patients. Next slide. Next slide. These are the related projects, and I want to call out to Jeff Carson, who is the PI for the vaccine trial. As a consequence of our ability to be nimble in recruitment of patients, it was identified that Rutgers could be a cornerstone in the global vaccine trial of J&J. Matter of fact, we were second in the world in recruiting for that vaccine trial. In addition, we were lead recruiters for interventional studies, the active trials through INCATS. So this could only happen through a very fine-honed clinical research machine. Next slide. And that really came together through the Clinical Trials Office. The Clinical Trials Office is a central resource for improving the efficiency of starting up clinical trials, high quality clinical trials, as well as recruiting targets. It is a soup to nuts organization for IRB approval, monitoring, and execution of clinical trials. In that day, and age. It was amazing. The IRB approval rates for interventional and observational trials in COVID took 96 hours. 96 hours. We're talking about 4 days. Now, I know people listening to here says it takes months to get the IRB approval. We didn't have the luxury of months, because in months, literally thousands, if not 10,000 of patients died. We needed to be nimble. And we found that ECRFs, electronic case report forms, electronic IRBs that were really still in the formative stages became the absolute foundation for doing clinical research. Next slide. So this is what the workflow looks like in a typical academic center to get a study approved and started. All those boxes are hands touching the protocol, and that typically would take 2 to 3, maybe 4 months. That was compressed, streamlined, and harmonized into 96 hours. Next slide. The sequential workflow was eliminated. Everything was done in parallel. And we were able to leverage our clinical research units for the logistics necessary to do the study. Next slide. Our current workforce now, the workflow has been compressed. We've taken the learnings of COVID and put that into action now across our ecosystem in doing clinical trials research. Next slide. What the clinical trials office does is it incorporates under one umbrella execution of studies, regulatory affairs, and the business of clinical trials. That is budget approval, contract signatures, and we work closely with our Rutgers IRB. All of these coming into one office allows us all to work to one goal: first patient, first visit. Next slide. So the development of a virtual clinical trial platform has been realized. This is the recruitment of patients without ever meeting the patient into a clinical trial. We completed three interventional studies in COVID, where our largest recruitment came from Minnesota and Texas, not New Jersey. Dan Horton was a PI on a Denon study where we were recruiting patients across the country in collaboration with our colleagues in industry. Next slide. So I want to pass this back to my team, a team where there is no I in team. We could never have done this without everyone, respectfully working together, but in a tireless manner to accomplish the tasks at hand. So back to you, Ralph, Dan, and Nancy.
Thanks, Ray. Now we're going to transition to the Q&A portion of today's talk. And so I'm going to just read the first question, and then I'm going to take down the screen so we can actually look at one another. And I'll put these also in the chat so you can refer to them. So the first question, which we'll pose to everyone, is what are some of the advantages and challenges associated with interdisciplinary research? So who would like to start addressing that?
So let me kick off by adding that interdisciplinary research is really challenging because we all come from a field of expertise and that we're very familiar with. We're comfortable with what we do and how we do it, but we have to give over control to others because they come from a different discipline with different metrics and different values. And it's really 1 + 1 = 3. So you have to respect and honor the talents of others in a discipline that you may be completely unfamiliar with. And you know, that's challenging.
Yeah, I second what Ray just said. I think that it's easy to understand what advantages of interdisciplinary work are, because obviously I'm not a trialist, or Dan is not an immunologist, or I'm not a pediatrician, even though I've been working with pediatricians much more than I would have thought it would ever happen in the last 2 years. So I think that it's easy to see the advantages. We don't all know everything, and together we know more than the sum of the parts. The challenges are harder to understand, and I think that Ray pointed to an important one, that is what can I say, release control of something to somebody else. And what I want to add is that is like talking among people that speak different languages. It's not easy to understand each other's language. It may cause misunderstandings, or I mean, one has to overcome the difficulty of understanding how other people think, how they operate, and it ain't easy. But the moment that you make that transition and you accept the fact that not everybody speaks the same language, then all of a sudden you learn, you actually gain from the multidisciplinarity.
And I think what happened with this group is we all came with different strengths of what our skill sets were, what our general interests were. I think we also came with a willingness to listen to one another and a great deal of respect for one another. And that respect grew quickly, because you just have to talk to these folks, and it's like, my goodness, are they amazing at what they do? And we quickly realized that as a group, we were incredibly strong. As an individuals, not as much. And no doubt what happened was that we were listening to each other, we were explaining things to each other, we were running ideas by each other, and ultimately, we got projects that were definitely better, that were multidisciplinary in the sense that they would include Marilla's work in the laboratory and trials and observational epidemiology studies and so forth. And we were able to pull from everyone's strengths and ask, what were the key questions in the field? What were we trying to achieve? What were our aims? And then pull the skill sets and the knowledge from all of us. And I've never been involved with a group that melded so quickly, and part of it was because you all don't know this group, but I didn't know this group. I mean, I never met Emily. I don't think I ever saw her in person until, I don't know, a few months ago, and I had never known Marilla before this started. And I had nice relationships with Ray and Marty, but not, we didn't do anything together at much. And it was the crisis of COVID, where this whole university rose to the occasion. I mean, in many ways you could look at the team as the university, and while we were sort of the core who were talking, I mean, almost every single night did we talk for months. But then we were able to the university rallied around us, and rallied, of course, to the horrendous pandemic that the world was facing. And I think that's why we were able to achieve it. But a lot of this was just having confidence enough in yourself to be comfortable listening and adopting everyone else's ideas, some of which are much better than yours, and not worrying about it, because you just have a goal of getting the best project you can.
Yeah, I think one of the things that was really unique about this particular collaboration was the level of commitment that everyone brought to it. So I have been involved in team science projects sometimes where there's like free riders who are not really doing anything. Maybe they give you their CV or bio sketch so that the project looks impressive, but then they take a hands-off approach. And that was exactly the opposite of what this was. Everyone from the most accomplished investigator on the project down to the undergrad who's never had a role in research before was really invested in the success. And I think a lot of it was around the topic, but there was no way to make a project this complicated, this time-sensitive work without that really full-hearted engagement. So I think our commitment was really a key to the success.
And I'll just add that, we've talked about all the advantages. I think a challenge with so many individuals involved and so many moving parts is just the coordination and keeping everyone kind of moving in the same direction. I think it came about through those frequent meetings, through the team coming together, discussing, troubleshooting, but that I think it was in a very concentrated way. We kept this enormous enterprise moving and growing. That it's I think a challenge and maybe other projects where you don't have that sense of urgency or emergency to really have that kind of catalyze all that coordination.
Were you the original group, or was there anybody else you were talking to at the beginning who kind of dropped out? I mean, I know you didn't have time for too much change. And this also seems like one big, blind date, right? Like a lot of you hadn't worked together before. And I always tell people, don't sign up for an MPI grant if you can't, if you've never worked together before. It's really risky. And maybe just the urgency of it maybe helped you. And it also seems like the stars aligned. I know I'm saying a lot here. The stars aligned because the IRBs were quick. Everything happened quickly, and so that probably helped you a lot and relieved some frustration. But it's just amazing that you just came together, and I'm assuming it's the original group, and you had day jobs and you devoted yourself to this, and it was really at warp speed. It's pretty incredible. It's really incredible.
Nancy, you raised some issues that are really interesting, like the IRB timing. The IRB cut its time because of us. It wasn't that the IRB volunteered to be quick, streamlined, and harmonized. We said you had to be, and this is how to do it. So what we did is we gave a vision to people so that they could get involved and they could own that change. Without that, I don't think we could have ever been so accomplished. So it was amazing, and others, we all rolled our sleeves up. I know Sandy Burrows, who's our finance manager for our institute, spent most of her time traveling between Newark and Piscataway getting masks for people so that we had enough masks and venipuncture tubes to do the study. And she is our finance manager. She has no skin in the game here. But what you were able to do is, hey, there was an unmet need, I'll do it. And that's what you need to do. And crisis always drives importance. But I would say, as you go into MPI mode and you become an MPI, you realize that the deadline is now your crisis. And you just got to do it, because there's always a reason not to write a grant, guaranteed. There's always a reason not to write a paper. I could give you 15 at any given time reasons, but the successful team really rallies behind the deadline to get it done, to get the task completed.
To add to what has been said, I think that two elements worked in our favor. Or in the favor of the project, as it was said, the sense of urgency that everybody was, I mean, the people that enrolled, everybody was, the IRB, I want to also, mention the fact that, for example, we were, since my group is lab people, they had to show up at work. They couldn't, this is, was not remote work. They had to be here in an essentially almost empty building. Out of maybe 20 or so labs, there were 3 that were working, 4 labs that were working, with not having with the speed or the pace that this work had, especially initially when the time points were so close to each other and the number of samples was enormous. I want to, for example, acknowledge the fact that Dan Fine, that works at Rutgers Dental School, who has nothing to do with RCC, and I had met maybe once in my life before, send over 3 people to work with my people to do the work, because we physically, it was impossible to keep the pace of the work, and the pace could not have been kept. And I think Jeff alluded to that, without institutional support. I want to also to acknowledge the fact that that beautiful lab that Dan showed in the slide wouldn't have been built without enormous support from RBHS, and we got funds to buy that equipment, which were outside of my regular grant funds.
Yeah, let me go back to the concept of the university. I honestly do think that a lot of this was, the university responding to, a once in a lifetime crisis. But it did in spades. And, when Ray pushed the IRB to get the review done quickly, it wasn't, oh, we can't do that, or we don't normally do that, or it's not our procedure, or other kinds of administrative stuff that some of you might have heard at Rutgers over the years, maybe. And there was none of that stuff. It was, we will get it done. We understand the urgency of it. We will be partnering with you. We wound up talking, for example, to the, we had our ideas. We would have calls with the IRB teams where we would go through what we'd want to do. They would help us refine the protocol so that it met their, criteria, so that they could approve it quickly. So it was a very collaborative process, which led to it getting done quickly. I remember, changing the subject slightly, that we were trying to recruit from the Robert Wood Johnson University Hospital, and it was. I've been here a while. I called the president of the hospital. I knew the senior administrators. They were getting on calls with us. Okay, how can we help you? What do you want to do? This happened every single day during this crisis. Now, normal team science, you're not left with a crisis, anything remotely like COVID was. But there are lessons there. Maybe the most important lesson, Ray, I got from the IRB part of this was they can actually do it this way. And when we say 96 hours, I would have thought 96 months, in the old way. And but I think everyone learned that we could do things more efficiently, still maintain the standards, maintain the protection of our research subjects, and use best methods possible, but still do it quickly. And a lot of this was ultimately about talking to one another, collaborating, setting a common goal, and then, honestly, everyone worked like dogs.
Has it led to any lasting change? Like, are things faster at the IRB now, or has it reverted back to the way it was?
I'll let Ray answer that.
No, well, look, I wish I could say, yeah, we're still 96 hours. No.
You'd be lying.
Yeah, but what we have developed, and this is sustained, Nancy, is a sense of respect for both, so that we are decreasing timelines and we are implementing innovative approaches that we wouldn't have thought we would have worked together. it was a them and us kind of mentality before, but now it's a we. So the we is getting things done because both have skin in the game. So we've seen a dramatic change in attitude on both sides. We respect what they do and they respect what we do. And together we're changing the world in our ecosystem. You know, and it's in a day at a time, a week at a time, but I'm seeing dramatic differences. You know, we are about to be approved by AHARP, which is a big central governance for IRBs because of the quality of our IRB. We didn't have that before, and we're optimistic at the end of this year we'll have accreditation. That's because we have high quality and we're working at a reasonable rate. So we are affecting change.
One other thing I wanted to mention that I think maybe hasn't come up yet is, and would be, I think, relevant to the folks watching this is, you know, we're obviously a team that has a very broad array of experience in terms of how many years we've been doing this and our different levels in our careers. And I think one of the things that was really lovely about this team was how willing everyone was to share credit and to promote the career development of those of us who are less far along. So when there were opportunities to talk to media, anyone on the team could be invited. It wasn't only the PIs, or it wasn't only the most senior person on the team. Or, you know, when it comes to who's going to lead this paper or who's going to do the podcast or what have you, you know, everyone was very willing to share credit and willing to make sure that we are all, you know, our careers are being advanced by this work that we're putting in.
I'm so enjoying this conversation, and I'm just wondering if you could reflect a little bit on, you all are really talking about the substance of the research, but then also the process of the team. When you were immersed in the crisis, when you were going through the motions on your nightly calls, did you all have any conversations about the team process and the team dynamics? Or is this sort of taking shape now retrospectively as you look back on your team experience?
You know, Ralph, that's interesting. I wish I could tell you we had a big vision for, you know, organizational structure, and we really built a team built on those principles. No. What we did was lean on each other. And you know, when one got tired, the other would pick up. And that's how that was organizational dynamics and in reality. But we didn't have a big vision. I mean, what we realized is the only way we're going to get through this is if we all work together. We all pulled in one direction.
It sounds like it involves a lot of trust that other people are going to be around to make up the slack when they need to, and you know, and also because of the different disciplines, you have to trust each other.
Yeah, and I think, you know, we quickly got to know each other so that when we ran into obstacles, we knew who the right person was to solve that problem. So I'm remembering at one point we had an issue around how were we going to get biospecimens from one place to another. You know, we can't have like Dan and Marilla and I driving trucks all over New Jersey. And of course, it was like, Ray's going to get on the phone. He's going to make some calls. We are going to find someone who can help us move those samples from one place to another. And there were, you know, multiple crises across the course of the project where we needed to find a quick solution. And we got to know each other well enough that we knew who could figure out a solution for each problem.
Think about one of our successes was the recruitment in the ensemble trial, which was the J&J vaccine trial. You know, that we're all really proud. We enrolled 840 patients. I mean, it really was the second largest recruitment site in the whole world who did this trial, and we were damn trying to be the first, but we couldn't catch Kentucky, but we kept trying. You know, when I think about kind of why we were successful, it had so much to do with the multidimensional part of our team. You know, so, you know, Ray was running the CRUs and they were the backbone to actually do the study. And so a lot of the organization came from that. But then there were a whole slew of other people that stepped to the plate and helped. Once again, we got the IRB done. Another issue that's always challenging is, can you get a contract with a pharmaceutical company in a reasonable period of time? Well, I can tell you Rutgers never could. And how many times did we hear stories about, when the contract was approved when the last patient was enrolled in that trial and it was closed, that kind of stuff. And part of the organization of Ray's clinical trials office that he described was he had a dedicated attorney who knew her marching orders were to get a contract. And there was a huge push, and papers weren't sitting on people's desks for days. This would, if it sat on someone's desk for more than a half an hour, it was a problem. And so it's an example. And then we had a ton of volunteers here, right? How many people volunteered for that vaccine trial who work here? The first person enrolled in that study is one of my clinical colleagues. And I didn't ask her to do it, but, she was there, in the very beginning. And so many of those who chose to participate in this trial were actually part of our community, including some of the members of this group actually were some of the early volunteers for that study. So what I'm trying to say is that there was pre-existing expertise, but it really was the working together, the team making things happen, where you pulled in different parts of the research community here, and everyone stepping up and getting it done. I'm still look back in that time and sort of shake my head and think, man, oh man, this was quite remarkable. And I really do think it was a lot about the crisis, but a lot about the willingness of everyone to sort of take their part, not worry about getting the credit. I mean, people give me credit for the ensemble trial. Trust me, that is not, that I don't deserve anywhere near the recognition people are saying, because there's so many others that were frankly more important. And it really was a university success, not an individual. And I think that ultimately is what team science is about.
And I think, and then I have to leave at 3. But before leaving, I want to say that in all this, I want to acknowledge the fact that initial PIs of this, Marty, Ray, and Jeff, really set the tone for what we've been saying. The respect for the more junior people, the having. So the blind date worked also because they made it work, and I think that they deserve that recognition.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So it's 3 o'clock, Nancy. I don't know. Are you planning?
Yeah.
Well, it's up to Dan. You're kind of.
Yeah. Well, I think. Do you want me to close, Ralph, or Nancy? Do you want to close?
Feel free to go ahead, Dan. That was fantastic.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you.
Anything, but
all right. Well,
so fascinating.
As I said before, it was a real honor and privilege to work with this group, not just those here, but so many others who led or took part in or worked on this study. So I just want to thank my fellow investigators and colleagues for sharing some of their experiences and insights today. This is wonderful, and appreciate everyone for tuning in.